Now that your Ktor API is ready to validate Google JWT tokens, let's talk about the Android app functionality. So testing this functionality can be really tricky. I recommend using a physical device and make sure that it's one that you can safely do a factory reset on. This allows you to test and retest a new user experience. So why a factory reset? I found it really difficult to go back to the initial state as if I were a new user. Google saves things on the back end. I think they save things in Google Play services. Basically, Google knows that you've signed up at least once for this app, and it stores that. So you'll want to be able to clear it. Now, I tried to do a couple things to clear this information. I went into Google Play services and I cleared the data, and I tried to uninstall it. And as I was trying to do things, I got the app in a strange state where it gave me an API error 10, caller not whitelisted to use this API. So eventually I was able to fix it by correctly uninstalling Google Play services and then go ahead and reinstall it and do an update. But I think it would just be easier to do a factory reset if you can, if it's just a development phone. And I think you're going to have a pretty good experience that way. So if you use an emulator, make sure to add a Google account to the device. Otherwise, you're going to get API error 16, cannot find a matching credential. And also make sure to test for this in your code, because a user could experience this on their phone if they don't have a Google account associated with it. Google tracks the amount of times a user dismisses the dialog, and they're going to put the user in a cooldown period if they do it too many times. So it's basically up to us to check to see how many times they've done this and sort of lock them out. And we can do this in the activity result, and I'll show you how that works in a second. But basically, while you're testing this, if you want to avoid that cooldown period, just open up your phone, open up the keypad, and dial this special code into it. And then once you finish entering the code, the keypad, I forget what happens. I think it just disappears, but you don't have to press enter or anything like that. It just accepts it. And then you're free to test as much as you'd like, and Google won't lock you out. So that's pretty much it for setup. Now let's go ahead and look at the code. In my Android app, I have secrets that I don't want to store on GitHub. So what I did to handle that is basically create an app.properties file. And in that file, I put the web client ID that I got from Google Cloud, and I also store the IP address to my Ktor API. And this way, I don't check this into Git, and to use it, I go to my Gradle build file, and then in your default config block, you just call build config field, and then you pass it the web client ID, and it gets the app properties from your file, and it also gets the IP address. So then you can use that from within your app, and you don't have to store any secrets. And for dependencies, I added the Kotlin coroutines for Play services, and I also added the Play services auth dependency, so we can call the one-tap API. Now for Ktor and my API service, I basically have a companion object that sets all my defaults. So here's how I'm using that special secret file. And I just call buildconfig.ktor IP address, and then it builds it. When I build the app, it injects that IP address right into it. And then I have all of my routes set here. And this is the constant API key value that's stored from the app and sent to Ktor. So we'll use that when we're getting a user by ID and go through the authentication on the Ktor side. And here's my getUser function, and it sends the N once as a string and the JWT token as a string. And I go ahead and I build my request here. It's a get request, and then I pass my route in. Ktor HttpClient works really well for creating and building these requests. I love all the built-in features that it has to send the authorization bearer header I only need to call Bearer Auth and then put the JWT token in, and Ktor HttpClient takes care of all that for me. And in my header, I specify the X and once and pass the M once key that's generated from my one tap, and I'll show you that in a second. Now, another thing I wanted to show you here is my error handling. I've done everything universally here, so my Ktor API always sends the same type of response, and I know what to look for. So what I've done is I've created a couple extension functions to handle these errors, and let me show you how this looks. So we get the exception, and if it's a server response exception or a client request exception, it takes the message and it converts it to error response. And what that does is, let me show you this. So HTTP client, the server response exception, we basically get a response and a cached response text. Now inside this text is what I'm passing back from my Ktor API, which is JSON. And this JSON can actually be converted into a data class on the client side. So what I do in this extension function is I parse this cached response text field and I find the text. So I want everything that's after this text block, and I drop the last because I need to drop the quotes from the actual response. And then what I do is convert it to my object. So like in this case, you can pass any type of object you want. If it's a user response, or maybe it's a city response to the city part of the API request. So it basically parses that text and then converts it to my data class that I've passed generically. Really cool stuff. I love how this works, and that way I can get a consistent error handling experience throughout the entire app. That's it for the get user route. So we're basically just authenticating with the M once and the JWT token here. The other API call is getting the user by ID. And this is really simple. It just passes the user ID, and in the header, we pass that API key that's unique and authenticated for this app. Now for the fun part, the Google one-tap integration. It would have been really easy for me to use Remember Launcher for activity result in my composables, but I decided to go a different route, and I'll try to explain why, and hopefully it'll make sense. So most of this one-tap implementation is on the client side, and it's very difficult to have the Viewmodel as the source of truth for this type of functionality. And there's a lot of passing back and forth from the user front end to the Viewmodel. So what I've decided to do is extract all of that functionality out and put it in its own class. And what that allows me to do is, let's say I wanted to build an app that has all sorts of logins: Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, Instagram. This way, with all of the code being in one class, you create a really good separation of responsibilities, and you isolate the code in one class. And I really liked how it worked out, so let me show you how it looks. So what I've basically done is created this Google sign-in observer, and it inherits the default lifecycle observer. So I get the owner of the lifecycle, which lets me tap into all of the activity components like on start, pause, created, things like that. So with that in place, I go through and I have a basic sign-in state, which is really simple. It doesn't store any sensitive information at all. It only stores the user message and whether or not the user is signing in currently. In my companion object, I create all sorts of static keys. So this is the key for the sign-up request, and this is the key for the sign-in request. And then here's my N-once, generate N-once, and this is built in right to the Ktor HttpClient, so really handy and cool. And then I set a bunch of variables here. What I'm using is the ActivityResultRegistry. And here's my Google sign-in client. Here's my sign-up request and my sign-in request. And then here are my launchers for the sign-up and sign-in. So now, when everything's initialized, I can go ahead and get my registry, and a lot of this is being handled with Hilt. I do some injection to inject the application, or the activity context rather, and I get my sign-in client from the Google API. And now I build my sign up request. And to sign up, it's pretty easy. You just set what you want. You can filter by authorized accounts. Here's where I set my N-once, and that static value goes into there. And for the sign-in request, it's very similar. The only difference is we set this auto select enabled, and that lets Google know, hey, you've already signed into this app, so use the existing account that's associated with this app. Now, when this class is created, or basically when the activity is created, I set up my handlers here, and I have this little helper function that lets me register the handler. So we'll go through here. So what this does is with the activity registry, it registers my activity here with the key and the owner. And here's where I call start intent for sender result. And basically, when I get the result, I have another helper function here, which handles the Google result. So, okay, the first thing it checks for is if the sign-in dialog has been canceled. Now, this is when we can check to see how many times a user has actually dismissed the window, and we're trying to prevent this cooldown period. So we can say basically you have, however many sign-in attempts remaining, and then you can show a snack bar on the UI side of things if this happens. Now, if the result's okay, we get the credentials, and then we get the JWT token, which is the Google ID token. So now we have to start a coroutine. I go ahead and do that, and then I call my user repository, and I call get user. So that's going to call the Ktor API and send the JWT token, and it's either going to bring back a user that already exists, or it's going to insert the user as a new user. And it's also going to save the user ID to my user preferences data store. And then, of course, if there's an error, we set the state to a user message, and we set the message, and that'll also show up in a snack bar on the UI presentation side. And again, I've created some generic error handling here. So I have, let me show you what this looks like. So this is my one-tap error, and it basically goes through and checks the status code. So if it's canceled, now this usually means that it can't find the credential for some reason. Maybe it's not on the phone, or there was something wrong, they've revoked the app or something like that. That's when you're going to get this API error 16, I believe it is. This is if you get a network error. Otherwise, it just says we couldn't get the credential from the result. So the class has a sign-in function where it launches the sign-in request. And then basically this is how we do that here with launch one tap. So we get in whether it's sign up or sign in. We update the state to is signing in equals true. And then we begin the sign in and we wait for it. And then go ahead and launch it. And then it's going to go through and hopefully bring back a response from Google. So there's also a sign out function, which is easy peasy. Just click sign out and that'll sign the user out of your app. And then user message shown, this is for the UI presentation layer. It calls this once the snack bar has been shown. Okay, and this restores state. Here's where things get tricky. I'm not using a view model here, so what I actually have to do is save the state to a bundle. And then on configuration changes and things like that, when my activity is recreated, I can restore this state back to how it was. And let me just show you that real quick in the main activity. So it gets my save state instance and it creates the sign-in observer. And then it basically checks to see if this exists. And if it does, it goes ahead and restores it. So there's two different ways depending on what API the user's phone is on. So that's pretty much it for the sign-in observer, and I'll show you how this works on the presentation side of things next. This is my home screen composable. So it takes this sign-in observer and collect a state with lifecycle. So it's observing that state that I showed earlier, where is signing in equals true or false, or if there's a user message or not. And then we set up our snack bar host state. And this front end is so light the way that I've set this up, which I really like. There's really very limited code that I need to show to make all of this work. So it checks if the user message is not null, then go ahead and show a snack bar. And once the snack bar has been shown, tell the sign-in observer that the user message has been shown, and it clears it and sets it back to null. Now, users, the way I set this up, it basically, a user has different states. It can be signed in, signed out. I handled all of that with a sealed class, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But basically, on this home screen composable, we go through and we say, when the home state current user is an unknown sign-in, then set up this state for me. So what it says is, basically, we want to sign up because it's an unknown sign-in. This user's never signed in before, and we want to show the sign up button. So it shows the Google sign up button. If it's a signed in user, do this. And if the user is signed out or not authenticated, then do this. And let me show you what that looks like real quick. So here's the current user sealed class. So we've got our signed in user where we have our user ID, name, and email. And then signed out user, unknown sign in, or not authenticated. And if they're not authenticated, we may have a message from the API with an error code, so we can go ahead and show that on the presentation side of things. Now real quick, I'll show you my user repository. So we've got the user ID and is signed out flag. And I've got this handy dandy flow here to return the current user. And what that does is it basically maps the user preferences to a data class. And then from that, it says if the user ID is less than or equal to 0, that means we have an unknown sign-in. If the user is signed out, then we have a signed out user. Otherwise, we go ahead and get the user from the Ktor API. So let's go into that real quick. So what we do here is say, okay, we've got the user ID. Go ahead and call my city API service. We'll authenticate with the API key instead of the JWT token, and we'll return the user. So what I do in my home Viewmodel is I collect that flow. So when the home screen loads, I know what kind of state the user is currently in. Now this is independent of the Google sign-in observer. So that tells me, it sets the home UI state to the current user, whether it's loading or not. And now the home screen also has its own user messages that are independent from the sign-in. On the account screen, I can do the exact same thing. I basically get the sign-in state from the sign-in observer. I set up my snack bar. So that's the same thing if the user message is shown or not. And then I can also hook up the Viewmodel to get the current user state and either show the sign out button or the sign in button based on what state the user's in. So that's pretty much it for the Android side of things. I've put links to all of this code down in the video description. So there's the Ktor API and also the Android source code. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and thanks for watching.